Hi, I'm Phil. I'm a psychotherapeutic counsellor and a trauma therapist. Today I'm going to talk about trauma triggers and how denial and dissociation, which are subconscious defenses that keep us detached from our historical trauma, can make us vulnerable to experiencing historical feelings of anxiety in the present without us realizing that this is the case. So, to get our heads around the concept, we need to consider that when we experience something traumatic, whether it's a single event or long-term exposure to a scary situation, that these situations leave an imprint on our brain, so we know what dangers to look out for in the future. But for some people, this imprint of our past experience might be dissociated or blocked off because their subconscious has made the decision that it's just easier to go through life in denial of those experiences. And if we've done this to manage our trauma, it sets us up to not have very good trigger recognition because the incident being triggered is no longer in our awareness. And this is because the subconscious part of the brain, it hasn't forgotten about all of this old terrible stuff. It's just not allowing the conscious brain to access it. So while we walk around in denial of what's happened to us, our subconscious is at the same time looking out for anything that relates to those incidents so it can warn us of the threat. So if our subconscious senses a threat and our conscious brain doesn't, because it's dissociating to maintain all of this denial, then that means that our hypervigilance is going to increase and we're going to start feeling more anxious, but we're not going to know why. So what we might do in this situation is project that fear onto something in the present and respond to it as though it's the threat we're perceiving it to be. Then, in response to the perceived threat, our fight, flight, freeze, or appease trauma response, or whichever one we go to, at whichever level of response we go to, that's going to give us options on how to deal with that situation and stay safe. That way, we can at least do something to reduce our anxiety. But the trouble is, whatever we do will only be a temporary fix, as we won't have addressed the real reason we were triggered in the first place, because that's still dissociated away. So, to better understand this concept, we need to realize that when our trauma gets triggered, our brain regresses or goes backwards to the point in our lives when the original trauma occurred, which means that we start to experience the world now as we did back then, and we respond defensively to stay safe. So, crawling under the bed as a 3-year-old to hide from parents fighting on the landing, that's a real sensible option for a 3-year-old brain that knows its body can't fight or run away to survive. And to help them cope better with this situation, their brain might also dissociate from the terror of those events so they can come out from under the bed when things have settled down a little. Because if they didn't dissociate or dampen down their terror somehow, they might never feel safe enough to come out. And to the biological part of their brain that's driven by survival instinct, that would mean death by starvation. So when that child grows up to be an adult, if they're triggered by raised voices or people arguing in their environment, they might regress to that earlier time again and once again feel all of that historical terror along with a powerful urge to hide, even though they may have no memory of hiding or feeling that terrified as a child. And regressing to a 3-year-old coping system, it's going to be counterproductive for adults. So there are going to be better ways to deal with situations than just that mindset. But if we've dissociated from that earlier experience and our trauma from that time has been triggered, then hiding away or burying our heads in the sand might be the only option available to us if we're in a regressed position, if we've gone into a 3-year-old place of our mind. So if we think about someone who's processed their historical trauma and accepted at a deeper psychological level that some of their past experiences were terrifying, they might be better able to connect the current trigger to that historical situation in that moment. And if they can do that, there's a likelihood that they're going to bring in some sort of rational argument to challenge their emotional responses to the trigger. So they might be able to catch the regression. So regression is something that we really need to be mindful of, whether you've got childhood CPTSD, PTSD, or you've been traumatized in any stage of your life, really. So in relation to triggers, we also need to be mindful that anything that hooks into our historical trauma has the capacity to trigger us, which means that we can also be triggered by positive experiences too. So an example of this would be if you have a 2-year-old child whose 3rd birthday is on Saturday and something distressing or terrifying happened to you on your 3rd birthday, your child's celebrations could trigger you to re-experience feelings of your memories from that 3-year-old part of your brain. And this might cause you to become hypervigilant or even trigger a full-blown panic attack at your child's birthday without you even realizing the cause. And this is because if that happened to you, your senses are still unconsciously alert for anything related to that terrible event on your third birthday, so you can prevent it happening again. So it doesn't matter if it's a negative event or a positive event. If your brain goes back there, there's a potential for re-traumatization. And this is why so many parents can suddenly experience an emotional decline when their children reach certain ages or certain stages of development, but denial will usually be stopping them from making the connection as to why. So in effect, we could say that trauma triggers are a form of negative nostalgia, and that there are just so many things that could hook into those early traumatic memories and trigger hypervigilance and regression. So we're all going to be unconsciously using our senses to see, hear, feel, smell, or taste potential threats in our environment. And the more traumatized we are, the more our senses are going to be on high alert. So having a good understanding of how our senses work and what they're attuned to pick up on in relation to our historical trauma is vital if we're wanting to understand how trauma works and how dissociation works. And we need to be mindful that our senses evolved when the world was very different from today. So, for example, back then, say, you go back several thousand years, anything that smelt like a wolf was a wolf. And we all knew back then that wolves were dangerous. That would have been keyed into our consciousness or taught to us at very young ages. Now, if you transpose that situation onto the world today, you can get a clearer sense of how certain smells might unnecessarily trigger your own historical trauma. So, for example, if you were attacked or abused as a child by a parent who drank heavily, then your brain is likely to generalize that that smell of alcohol. It's going to generalize that smell means danger, and anyone smelling like that could trigger your brain into a more hypervigilant state or into full-on regression, depending on how dangerous your brain interprets the smell of alcohol as being. And the same would apply if your abuser or attacker wore a particular aftershave or perfume, because anyone wearing that scent is going to smell like a wolf to you. But your other senses will also be doing the same. So simply seeing or hearing someone intoxicated from a distance could be enough to trigger your hypervigilance. Because if you've been brought up around people with alcohol, you're gonna know how they look, their body language, their slurring, the tone of their voice. There's going to be so many things that that are going to hook into your senses. And in the old days, if you go back to them a few thousand years ago, it would be the howling of wolves or the sight of paw prints on the floor that triggered the same levels of increases in vigilance. So in effect, our senses can be a gift and a curse when it comes to trauma, as although they're working to keep us safe from the wolves in our environment, they can also be misinforming us of the presence of wolves. So when it comes to understanding dissociation, we need to recognize that it's absolutely necessary for survival. We just need to gain better awareness of how it might be preventing us from having more choices when we get triggered into a regressive state. And if you think about it logically, so many people will be relying on dissociation, not only to maintain mental health, but also because we need to be able to dissociate so we can do our job. And some good examples of this would be paramedics, armed forces, police, fire brigades, as well as anyone who lives in a war zone, in poverty, in severe climate, on a dangerous estate. So for these people, dissociation is absolutely necessary, to assist them to cope with their lot. But all that dissociated content that these people deal with every day, it doesn't just disappear once the battle's over or the emergency's been dealt with or the fire's been put out. It remains held in their bodies, and their senses are going to be seeking out anything that resembles that traumatizing experience in the future, so it can activate fight or flight behaviors to survive. And that'll be where the regression comes in, of course. And if we somehow lose the capacity to dissociate, which we can, if we get burnt out or ill, or if we just have to deal with one trauma too many, because we all have a tipping point, then all those repressed feelings are likely to flood into our body at the same time. And managing anything then is going to become a real problem. And that's often when people come to therapy, because when dissociation is working, why would they bother? So this is why it's really useful if you can decompress and talk about some of this stuff that you've had to deal with at work or the scary incidents you get involved in. Because if you can own the experience and recognize what you're feeling in response to it, and realize that that situation was tough or that you were lucky to survive it, then you're not just popping it away in a box with a bit of a dodgy lid. You're raising your awareness and accepting the experience. So in effect, you're reducing the likelihood of being triggered into those feelings in the future. It's why it's really important that children have someone to talk to and be heard if they get frightened, because if they don't, they may have to develop the capacity to dissociate from those experiences just so they can keep going. But if they can talk, they can let it out, they can rationalize what happened, they can realize that it was an incident that's probably not going to be a common incident. If they can get that reassurance, then the brain will hear that, and it might be able to give them that reassurance if they encounter the same situation in the future as adults. But if you dissociate, you aren't going to have that capacity. So talking to a therapist about your historical stuff is working towards doing the same thing. But it doesn't mean to say that you have to go in there and rip open all those old boxes of trauma you've got buried away and feel all that old stuff straight away. Some people will do that because their process will take them in that direction. And those who don't, though, they might also benefit from just acknowledging that they've been through a lot, especially if the voice of their dissociation is telling them that they haven't, or that other people have had it far worse than them, which is something I hear regularly. Because just the acknowledgement that we've had it tough is sometimes enough for us to start giving ourselves options when we suddenly feel ourselves regressing or spiraling into anxiety. So in effect, the more we can talk about this stuff, the more we can process it. That is the opposite to dissociation. So even if we're talking about it and we still can't recognize the feelings relating to those events, it's still important, because then the more logical part of your brain may be able to counter triggers in the future if you can at least understand that what happened in your past would have been scary. So, well, hopefully that was useful for you. But trauma is a big topic to fit in a small video. So if you have any questions, or you'd like me to go into a little more detail on any aspects of this, drop me a line in the comments and I'll see if I can knock a video up for you. Well, take care and thanks for watching. Bye.